Bullies grabbed her clothes to mock. Her punch broke a tooth. The fluorescent lights of Jefferson High School cast harsh shadows across the crowded hallway as Kira Delacroix pressed herself against the row of dented lockers, hoping to blend into the peeling paint. Her oversized thrift store sweater hung loose on her small frame, and her worn sneakers squeaked against the linoleum as she clutched her books tighter to her chest. The morning rush of students flowed around her like a river around a stone, their voices creating a wall of sound that made her feel even more invisible. Kira had been at Jefferson for 3 months now, ever since her family moved from Louisiana after her father lost his job at the oil refinery. The transition from small-town bayou life to suburban Atlanta had been jarring enough without having to navigate the social hierarchy of a school where everyone seemed to have known each other since kindergarten. Her soft Creole accent and second-hand clothes marked her as different, and in a place like Jefferson, different meant target. She kept her head down as she walked toward her first period biology class, her dark hair falling like a curtain around her face. What none of her classmates knew was that beneath her quiet exterior lay 15 years of training in Krav Maga and Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, disciplines her grandfather had taught her from the time she could walk. But Papa's lessons came with strict rules about when and why to use her skills, and dealing with teenage cruelty didn't qualify as self-defense in his book. The first warning sign came as a shadow fell across her path. Trevor Holloway stepped directly in front of her, his Letterman jacket stretched tight across his broad shoulders. The star linebacker had the kind of confident smirk that came from never being told no, and his pale blue eyes held the cold calculation of someone who enjoyed having power over others. "Well, look what we have here," Trevor drawled, his voice carrying the practiced authority of someone accustomed to commanding attention. Swamp girls trying to sneak through without saying hello. Behind him, his constant companions materialized like sharks sensing blood. Madison Pierce, the head cheerleader whose perfectly styled blonde hair seemed to defy gravity, crossed her arms and surveyed Kira with the disdain of someone examining an insect. Her smile was sharp enough to cut glass, and she wielded it like a weapon. "Oh my God, Trevor, look at that sweater," Madison said, her voice pitched loud enough for the gathering crowd to hear. "Did you fish that out of a donation bin?" The third member of their trio, Blake Morrison, snickered as he pulled out his phone. The wannabe influencer documented everything, and Kira could already see him angling for the perfect shot to humiliate her online. His carefully styled hair and designer clothes screamed of parents who bought him popularity, and he wore his cruelty like a badge of honor. Kira tried to step around them, but Trevor shifted to block her path again. "Now, that's not very friendly," he said, his voice taking on a mocking tone. "We're just trying to welcome you to our school." "Maybe we should give her a makeover," Madison suggested, her eyes lighting up with malicious glee. "I mean, that whole thrift store chic thing isn't really working for her." The hallway had begun to form a loose circle around them, other students slowing their pace to watch the show. Kira recognized some faces from her classes, but none of them met her eyes. They were content to be spectators to her humiliation, and their silent complicity stung almost as much as the words themselves. Kira's voice was barely above a whisper when she finally spoke. "I just want to get to class." "What was that?" Trevor cupped his ear dramatically. "Sorry, I don't speak Bayou." The laughter that followed felt like needles against her skin. Kira's hands tightened on her books, and for a moment she felt the familiar surge of controlled aggression that her grandfather had taught her to channel. But his voice echoed in her mind, reminding her that fighting should be a last resort, used only when all other options were exhausted. She tried once more to move around them, but this time Madison stepped forward and accidentally bumped into her. Kira's books scattered across the floor, and the sound of papers rustling mixed with the renewed laughter of their audience. "Oops," Madison said, her voice dripping with false concern. "Sorry about that. Maybe you should watch where you're going." As Kira knelt to gather her scattered belongings, she caught sight of someone in her peripheral vision. Danny Chen stood by his locker about 20 feet away, his camera hanging around his neck as always. He was the quiet photographer for the school newspaper, and something about his gentle demeanor and genuine smile had caught her attention from the first day. Unlike the others, he'd never laughed at her accent or made comments about her clothes. Their eyes met for just a moment, and she saw something there that might have been concern, maybe even anger on her behalf. But before either of them could act, the warning bell rang, and the crowd began to disperse. "Better hurry up, swamp girl," Trevor called over his shoulder as he walked away. "Wouldn't want to be late on top of everything else." The next few weeks established a pattern that made Kira's stomach clench every morning when she woke up. The trio seemed to have an uncanny ability to find her wherever she went. In the cafeteria, they'd walk past her table and make loud comments about the smell of her homemade lunch. In the library, they'd whisper just loud enough for her to hear about her outdated phone and worn backpack. The worst incidents happened in the less supervised areas of the school. The stairwell between the second and third floors became a particular danger zone, where Trevor would accidentally shoulder check her into the wall, or Madison would make cutting remarks about her appearance that left Kira feeling small and worthless. But it was in the courtyard behind the gymnasium where things escalated beyond mere words. Kira had been eating lunch alone at a picnic table, trying to lose herself in a book, when the shadow fell across her page again. "Reading alone again, I see," Trevor said, settling onto the bench across from her without invitation. Madison and Blake flanked him, their expressions promising entertainment at her expense. "You know, I've been thinking," Madison said, examining her perfectly manicured nails. "There has to be a reason why you're so antisocial. I mean, normal people try to make friends." "Maybe she thinks she's too good for us," Blake suggested, his phone already recording. "You know how some people get when they move to a better place. They think they're special." Kira closed her book slowly, her fingers tracing the worn cover. "I'm not bothering anyone. I just want to eat lunch." "See? There's that attitude again," Trevor said, his voice hardening. "You come to our school, you eat our food, you breathe our air, and you can't even be bothered to be social." The confrontation might have ended there, as it usually did, with Kira packing up her things and finding somewhere else to go. But then Danny appeared at the edge of the courtyard, his camera bag slung over his shoulder and his expression troubled. "Hey, Kira," he called out, his voice carrying clearly across the space. "I was looking for you. Mrs. Peterson wanted to know if you'd be interested in helping with the literary magazine. She said your essay about Louisiana was really good." The simple act of someone acknowledging her existence, let alone praising her work, sent a warm flutter through Kira's chest. Danny's smile was genuine, and for a moment she forgot about the three predators sitting across from her. "I'd like that," she said, her voice stronger than it had been in weeks. But Trevor's expression had darkened at the interruption. "Well, well. Looks like Swamp Girl found herself a boyfriend. Danny, right?" Madison's voice took on a sickeningly sweet tone. "You probably don't realize this, but you're talking to the school's charity case. We were just trying to help her understand how things work around here." Danny's jaw tightened, and Kira saw his hands clench around his camera strap. "Looks to me like you're just being cruel for no reason." "Cruel?" Trevor stood up, his considerable height advantage making him loom over the smaller boy. "We're being educational. Someone needs to teach both of you about respect." The confrontation escalated quickly from there. Blake continued recording as Trevor stepped closer to Danny, using his size to intimidate. Madison made cutting remarks about Danny's white knight complex and suggested that maybe he and Kira deserved each other since they were both weird. But it was when Trevor shoved Danny, sending him stumbling backward and nearly dropping his camera, that something shifted in Kira's chest. The familiar surge of controlled aggression rose up, but this time it came with a clarity that hadn't been there before. This wasn't about her anymore. They were threatening the one person who had shown her kindness, and that crossed a line she hadn't even known existed. She stood up slowly, her movements deliberate and controlled. "Leave him alone." Trevor turned to her with a laugh. "Oh, now you want to play protector? That's rich." "I said leave him alone." Kira's voice carried a new quality, something that made Madison take a half step backward without realizing it. "Or what?" Trevor spread his arms wide, playing to his audience. "What are you going to do about it, swamp girl?" For a moment, Kira felt the weight of her grandfather's teachings, the countless hours of training, the discipline he'd instilled in her, the responsibility that came with knowing how to hurt people. But she also felt the accumulated weight of weeks of humiliation, the sting of being treated as less than human, and the protective fury that came from seeing someone she cared about being threatened. "I'm asking you nicely," she said, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her system. "Please leave us alone." Trevor's response was to laugh and turn back toward Danny. "You know what, picture boy? I think you need to learn some respect too." What happened next moved with the fluid inevitability of a dance Kira had practiced 1,000 times. Trevor reached for Danny's camera, intending to grab it, to break it, to humiliate him the way they'd been humiliating her. But Kira moved faster than anyone in that courtyard had ever seen her move. Her grandfather's voice echoed in her mind as she stepped forward, her body shifting into the familiar stance that had become second nature. Violence is never the first choice, Cher, but sometimes it's the only choice that matters. Trevor's hand was inches from Danny's camera when Kira's palm strike caught him in the solar plexus. The impact drove the air from his lungs and sent him stumbling backward, his face shifting from confident cruelty to shocked surprise in the space of a heartbeat. "What the hell?" he gasped, his voice reduced to a wheeze. Madison's perfectly composed facade cracked. "Trevor, get up! She just got lucky!" But Trevor was already moving forward again, his embarrassment fueling his anger. He swung widely, telegraphing the punch in a way that would have made Kira's grandfather shake his head in disappointment. She ducked under his arm and swept his legs, sending him crashing to the ground with a satisfying thud. Blake had stopped recording, his phone forgotten in his hand, as he stared at the scene unfolding before him. "Holy shit," he breathed. The sound of Trevor hitting the ground seemed to break whatever spell had held the small crowd of onlookers. Students began to emerge from the edges of the courtyard, drawn by the commotion. Some had their phones out, already recording what promised to be the most talked-about incident of the semester. Trevor struggled to his feet, his face red with embarrassment and rage. "You think you're tough? You think you can just—" He charged forward again, and this time Kira didn't hesitate. Her grandfather had taught her that once a fight began, you finished it quickly and decisively. She sidestepped his clumsy rush, grabbed his arm, and used his own momentum to send him sprawling across the courtyard. "Stay down," she said, her voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who knew exactly what they were capable of. But Trevor was beyond reason now. His pride had been wounded in front of an audience, and his only thought was to reassert his dominance. He came at her again, this time with Blake joining him, apparently deciding that 2 against 1 were better odds. What followed was a display of controlled violence that left everyone watching in stunned silence. Kira moved with the fluid grace of someone who had spent years perfecting her craft, her body shifting and flowing around their attacks like water around stones. Every strike was precise, every movement calculated for maximum effect with minimum effort. Blake went down first, a perfectly executed throw that sent him tumbling across the grass. He stayed down, clutching his shoulder and staring at Kira with something approaching awe. Trevor lasted longer, his size and strength making him a more challenging opponent. But size meant nothing when facing someone who understood leverage, timing, and anatomy. Kira caught his next punch, twisted his arm behind his back, and drove him face first into the ground. For a moment she held him there, his arm hyperextended just to the point of pain, but not injury. This was the moment her grandfather had always warned her about, the moment when the power to hurt someone completely was in her hands. She could feel the tremor in Trevor's arm, knew that one more twist would break it, would give her the kind of definitive victory that would ensure he never bothered her again. But Papa's voice was stronger than her anger. The moment you become the thing you hate, Cher, you've lost more than any fight could ever cost you. She released his arm and stepped back, her breathing steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her system. Trevor rolled over, his face a mask of pain and humiliation, and she saw something in his eyes that hadn't been there before, genuine fear. "I don't want to fight you," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the silent courtyard. "I never wanted to fight any of you. I just wanted to be left alone." Madison, who had been frozen in shock during the entire confrontation, finally found her voice. "You're crazy. You're absolutely crazy." "No," Kira said, turning to face the girl who had tormented her for weeks. I'm tired. I'm tired of being treated like I'm not human. I'm tired of being laughed at and pushed around and made to feel like I don't belong anywhere." She looked around at the faces staring at her, some shocked, some impressed, some frightened. "I never asked for any of this. I just wanted to go to school and learn and maybe make a friend or two. But you decided I was an easy target, and you were wrong." Danny stepped forward, his camera forgotten, his expression mixing admiration with concern. "Kira, are you okay?" The simple question, asked with such genuine care, almost broke her composure. She nodded, suddenly feeling the weight of what had just happened settling on her shoulders. Trevor struggled to his feet, his face a mixture of pain and something that might have been respect. "Where did you learn to fight like that?" "My grandfather," she said simply. "He taught me that fighting should be a last resort. But when someone threatens the people you care about, sometimes it's the only option." The crowd that had gathered began to disperse as the sound of approaching footsteps indicated that faculty were finally arriving. But the damage was done, and everyone who had witnessed the confrontation knew that the social dynamics of Jefferson High had shifted permanently. In the weeks that followed, Kira found herself navigating a completely different school environment. The whispers that followed her through the hallways now carried undertones of respect rather than mockery. Students who had never acknowledged her existence before nodded politely when they passed her in the corridors. Trevor, Madison, and Blake kept their distance, their former confidence replaced by a wary respect. The videos of the fight had spread through social media faster than wildfire, and the narrative that emerged wasn't about a violent outburst, but about someone finally standing up to bullies who had gone too far. More importantly, her friendship with Danny had deepened into something more meaningful. They spent their lunch periods together now, talking about photography and literature and the small dreams that made high school bearable. He had been there in the courtyard when she needed someone to defend, and she had been there when he needed protection. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked one afternoon as they sat in the same courtyard where everything had changed. "Fighting back, I mean." Kira considered the question carefully. "I regret that it came to that. I regret that talking and reasoning and trying to be invisible didn't work, but I don't regret standing up for myself, and I definitely don't regret protecting you." "Your grandfather would be proud," Danny said. "I think he would," she agreed. "He always said that strength isn't about being able to hurt people. It's about knowing when not to, and having the courage to act when it matters." 3 months after the confrontation, Trevor approached her table in the cafeteria. The entire room seemed to hold its breath as he stood there, his hands shoved deep in his pockets, his expression unreadable. "Can I sit?" he asked. Kira nodded, curious about what he might have to say. "I've been thinking about what happened," he said slowly. "About what I did." what we did. And I wanted to say, I'm sorry. The apology hung in the air between them, and Kira could feel the weight of everyone listening. I don't know why I thought it was okay to treat you like that, he continued. I guess I thought, I don't know what I thought, but you were right to stand up for yourself. You were right to fight back. Fighting back was never the point, Kira said quietly. The point was that I shouldn't have needed to. Trevor nodded, his expression thoughtful. Yeah, I get that now. He stood up to leave, then paused. For what it's worth, I'm glad you didn't break my arm. You could have, couldn't you? Yes, Kira said simply, but you didn't. That says something about who you are. As he walked away, Kira felt a sense of completion that had been missing since the confrontation. She had stood up for herself without losing her humanity, had shown strength without becoming cruel, had earned respect without becoming feared. The final bell rang, signaling the end of another day at Jefferson High. As she walked through the hallways toward her locker, Kira reflected on how much had changed since those first terrifying weeks. She still wore thrift store clothes and spoke with a Creole accent, but those things no longer marked her as a target. Instead, they were simply part of who she was, and that was enough. Danny was waiting by her locker, his camera bag slung over his shoulder and a genuine smile on his face. Ready to go? Ready, she said, shouldering her backpack. As they walked toward the exit, Kira thought about the lesson her grandfather had tried to teach her all those years ago. Violence was never the first choice, but sometimes it was the only choice that mattered. More importantly, the real strength lay in knowing the difference, in having the courage to act when necessary, and in never losing sight of who you were in the process. The setting sun cast long shadows across the parking lot as they walked toward the bus stop, two students who had found each other in the chaos of high school hierarchy. Behind them, Jefferson High stood silent and imposing, but it no longer felt like a prison. It was just a building, filled with people learning how to be human, making mistakes, and sometimes, if they were lucky, learning from them.